You are listening to IDEA Collider, a show that examines opportunities and challenges in pharmaceutical development, looking for inspiration for the next generation. I'm your host, Alex Gray.
Welcome, Tom and Alex, to the next installation of the IDEA Collider podcast. Why don't we start with introductions first before we get into the discussion? So my name is David Radwaner. I am a Vice President of Strategic Consulting at IDEA Pharma. Tom, why don't you go next?
Yeah, absolutely. My name's Tom Brockbank, Senior Consultant, IDEA Pharma. Been with IDEA Pharma for 5+ years and worked across a lot of oncology in that time as well. Alex?
Yeah, and I'm Alex Gray. I'm the Chief Medical and Innovation Officer at IDEA Pharma. Been working in oncology for around 30 years.
To a degree, Keytruda has come out on top as the key winners of the IRAs. And now we want to look to the future and think about what will the next 10 years bring. Who is going to own the immunotherapy space in oncology and supersede and take the crown from Merck and Keytruda? So with that in mind, Alex, as our Chief Medical Officer, I'd be curious to hear your perspective on, what makes PD-1 and PD-L1 therapies unique and what has allowed them to, become this dominant modality on the market. Before we look at what the future could hold, I think it's probably useful for us to anchor and ground ourselves into what the past has taught us thus far.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think in many ways, immunotherapy in cancer doesn't have a desperately long history, at least not that most people would recognize. I think people have been looking at this on and off for a long time, but it never really got much traction. And obviously CTLA-4 was the first one in, ipilimumab with, from BMS. And I think at that time there were people investigating PD-1 and PD-L1, the two, binders of each other in the immune system, and trying to understand what that could do. And it's very easy to look back now. It all might seem very obvious, but at the time it was a lot less obvious. The Keytruda story, I think, is fascinating in that regard, as it same obviously from the BMS's angle as well with nivolumab. So obviously, we had a Nobel Prize for the discoveries around PD-1, Tasuku Honjo and Jim Allison. I'm sure most people know their names, but they did a lot of that background research. And what they understood, and uncovered was that this is really acting as a brake on the immune system, the immune response to cancer, that PD-L1 expression within tumours binding to PD-1 mostly on cytotoxic CD8 lymphocytes, which could target those cancer cells and destroy them, was producing inhibitory signaling that made, the immune response acquiescent to the tumor. And, they kind of hit on the major checkpoint. So CTLA-4 was always very interesting, but PD-1, PD-L1 has turned out to be the most important checkpoint. As we know, subsequently, there are other checkpoints in the immune system, but none of them, blocking them, has not produced anywhere near the same level of outcome or the breadth and depth that we've seen with PD-1, PD-L1 interactions.
And is it really that breadth and depth that makes PD-1, PD-L1 so unique, or is it the durability that you see out of responses? I mean, what has, in your opinion, Alex, really led to the success of this class of therapy and why we see it being used across numerous oncology indications? What is it that allows it to do that?
Yeah, I mean, David, you're exactly right that, we're lucky that blockade of that interaction has had utility across a pretty broad range of tumours and produced, we always talk about the tail of the curve, that this is obviously not just about upfront response, regression of tumour, or indeed just putting it into stasis so that you've got stable disease. It's the durability of that, in terms of progression-free survival, but then actually an OS curve that outstrips its relationship with response and even PFS. So you're seeing long-term survival that would have been unimaginable before that in many of these tumours. There is a flip side. It's easy to forget there are plenty of people who don't benefit. I mean, there are tumour types that don't benefit. You've got very cold tumours like prostate, for example, or pancreatic, PD-1 has not been effective as a blocker in that context. And there are people within many tumours that are in theory sensitive, you still don't get benefit. So it's not been a universal panacea, but it's clearly moved the game forward massively in many of those, many tumors and for many people who get them.
Thanks. What's been fascinating is, of course, if you go back in time, it wasn't obvious that Keytruda would be the winners or the leaders in this space. There was a time where it looked like BMS and Opdivo as the first to market and the first PD-1 therapy to get a couple of indications was very likely to be the leaders, with Keytruda being a follow-on asset. Now, of course, we have the benefit of hindsight being 2020. We know that Keytruda ultimately was able to take over and become the market dominant leader here. Some have speculated that it might be due to maybe intrinsic differences in the assets. Others, and I think this is our opinion, but I'd be curious to hear yours, Alex, believe that actually came down to the strategic decisions that Merck made and how to study this therapy. So, Alex, having been so well versed in the space for so long, I'm curious on your perspective, what allowed Merck and Keytruda to really overtake BMS and Opdivo and become this market dominant leader?
Yeah, it's a great question, because the two drugs actually were launched at a very similar time. I mean, within a couple of months of each other. Certainly not enough realistically to have made a big difference. The timing, it's well recorded that Opdivo going out of the gate quicker in terms of volume of use, sales as well in those early days, and then there was absolutely an inflection point, which we'll come to about what happened with that. I mean, I think that there's lots of layers of this is a really interesting case study, actually. I mean, I think with Merck, they started to realize that they had something in their hands that could have really broad utility and impact survival in a way that nothing else had for a very long period of time. I mean, just go back historically, we saw very small, relatively small incremental gains, sadly, with the introduction of new therapeutics. And although the TKI era had done wonders for people with specific mutations, driving mutations, that outside of that we hadn't necessarily made a vast amount of progress. So they made some key decisions as they moved forwards. They put the modality into lots of different tumor types early, because the translational science was always a bit problematic. What translating over from those preclinical models had proven difficult to get a reliable path forwards. There are some things that we now know, didn't work in preclinical that did work in man, and the inverse of that. So, they threw it at a lot of different tumor types and learned through that. And again, it's easy to forget, but a decent amount of it didn't work, actually. Or rather, they had broad populations where, the lack of biomarker-led strategy meant that things didn't necessarily work out. The other thing they did, which I think is a really interesting piece of the story that's often not talked about, was that they designed their studies in a way that allowed them to do that level of investigation without breaking the bank. I mean, they spent a huge amount of money doing this, but not as much as they could have done. And that was born out of some very clever statistical work they did, looking at how they could maximize the value of their sample sizes, with two guys called Bob Beckman and Con Chen, who are at Merck, who are given sort of free rein to look at novel ways of really, doing those basket trials in an efficient fashion to get the signals to move on. So, some very interesting learnings about how they went about doing this. That breadth of signaling honestly turned out to be very important. I mean, you look now at the number of indications that Keytruda has in comparison with Opdivo, and then, of course, the other PD-1s and PD-L1s, it's massively ahead. So they got in quick and really went sideways very rapidly, which was not necessarily obvious that one could do that at that kind of pace, but they achieved that, absolutely.
Interesting. That BMS was not able to keep up with. I'm curious, was there anything else? Was it the choice of combination partner? Was there a specific indication that you noticed or started to sense, looking back at it, that Merck was likely to now become the leader?
No, it's a great question, because if you think the two drugs were launched at from a time, and you asked that question earlier about is there anything in the pharmacology? I mean, it's genuinely very difficult to believe there is much between them in terms of their pharmacology between the two PD-1s. I mean, there's been a long debate about the PD-L1s that came in, because obviously PD-1 combined to PD-L2 as well. So, you know, you are doing something a bit different with that. But in all honesty, I think there's very little evidence that these two drugs differ substantially in terms of their effect. So it was how you studied, where you studied, you know, that made the difference going forward. So the volume mattered. The other thing that was very important about the statistical piece that people forget is that, you know, the belief at the front end was, oh, you know, this could be a universal mechanism. We'll throw it at everybody. They started in lung cancer because it's a tumor that's amenable to IO. In other words, it was warm enough as an environment to throw PD-1, anti-PD-1 into. Didn't really know, you know, was everybody going to benefit? Was it going to be subgroups in the population who benefited? But being able to power the trial so they could look at all of that on the way. I mean, there's tons out there in the literature about going on sort of post hoc fishing trips as opposed to structuring your trials in a way where you really are trying to work out whether certain, in this case, biological factors are going to drive your outcome. They were smart in the way that they chose to do that. And, you know, I was going to ask this over to Tom, because there's, you know, there's a big inflection point that we saw. Second line lung cancer, great data from both the drugs. That's how they got out of the gate. They were obviously doing melanoma and RCC as well. That, you know, they both looked at that in fairly early days, both again IO amenable tumors, particularly melanoma. But broad population in second line showed a clear benefit over standard of care in chemo, you know, single agent chemo then. But then they had to move to front line, different set of circumstances. And Tom, they did some different things, didn't they, between the two of them that I think made a difference. So.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, David, you mentioned the inflection point. Most people point to first line non-small cell as that is the inflection point. I mean, we talked about Opdivo, and BMS coming out the gate quickly. Just going quickly back to that, and we can see, I said they both went into melanoma, but Opdivo obviously sort of had kidney at second line, lung, as Alex mentioned there as well. BMS also had the experience of Yervoy in melanoma, so they had that sort of experience, which also backed up the argument that maybe they were going to be that sort of, you know, quick one out the gate and the winner at first. But it really is the first line non-small cell. So they both had obviously studies there, but they did split how they sort of looked at the patient population, which one they wanted to recruit as well. So Merck deliberately went for a narrower population. I think, you know, we talked about the statistics, which patient populations to look at, which biomarkers to go at. They went at a PD-L1 greater than 50% expression there. So a smaller population. They also deliberately removed some sort of biomarker-driven populations like ALK mutations, things like that, because they wanted a population which, as we said, we now know in hindsight it worked, but they didn't know off the bat, hey, this is going to where will over-index and necessarily work. Whereas Opdivo went for a broader population, potentially driven by a commercial decision. You know, if they can win there and get a label there, they're going to have more patient volume, which is good, but also they're going to have more use there. But the Keytruda Merck study was successful, BMS's wasn't. And so just off the fact that it had a failed study there allowed Merck and Keytruda to get their label in first line lung. And not only is it an inflection point, you know, in terms of sort of you start to see that revenue divergence there, but it really cemented themselves in as that sort of foundational therapy in lung. And then when you start to think about, and David, I know you'll sort of come onto it, how they expanded that, they could then expand away with chemotherapy combinations to expand the populations there. And when you look at how, you know, Merck then expanded their indications as well, that sort of foundation, which was set in first line non-small cell, really set them as the foundation for many other tumor types as well. And that sort of therapy that others wanted to add on to. But yeah, and that's how they set that foundation there. And I think, you know, from my perspective, we do see that inflection point there. Okay.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because obviously the cut-offs of, you know, the world knows that PD-L1 expression matters. It's actually, you know, it's an imperfect biomarker. There are people who are PD-L1 low who do respond to PD-1 inhibition, and there are clearly people who are positive or have higher expression who don't. But it's pretty good, and it's good enough to have segmented the population. But they were very good at hunting for that and looking for the different cut-offs and the different tumors that were needed. And, again, it's easy to forget that, they went hunting for, MSI-high, DMMR populations as well. I mean, they did all that groundwork. So again, even that minority population, I mean, it's about 5%. I mean, it differs across tumors, allowed them access into things like colorectal cancer, for example. And they were very smart at getting a broad label for MSI-high DMMR across populations of tumors. So, a tumor-agnostic biomarker-led strategy. Again, easy to look back and go, wow, that was a smart thing to have done. But, nobody really tried these things. I mean, people were plodding through individual tumor types, and they may have had a biomarker-led approach, but, think of things like, I don't know, EGFR, or people hadn't really considered that kind of pan-tumor approach before. So, there was novel statistics, novel regulatory strategy in here as well. And all of that added up to being able to define the market in a way that other people had been unable to achieve.
Do you think Merck did a better job of following the science? Or do you think they got a little lucky? Or do you think it was a little bit of both?
I think that's a great question, actually, because I think they were very good, actually, at the biomarker piece particularly. I think that's very fair to say that they went at that with aplomb. I think it's also right to say that they threw the drug against a lot of tumor types or stages where it didn't work. Again, it's very easy to forget all of that early history. Was that following the science? I mean, again, I think many people might have forgotten this, but there was debate at the time, actually, about quite large populations of people who were receiving Keytruda in phase 2 and even some rapid acceleration into phase 3 trials. And that actually at the time the FDA had a panel, they raised concerns around this, that we were taking signals and really amplifying up into big populations. And obviously their primary duty is around safety. So, was this all sweetness and light? I really don't think it was. The question of luck, I think, is allied to that. Maybe if you throw a lot of stuff against the wall, some of it's going to stick. I mean, there's this very famous quote from Roger Perlmutter, who was the head of R&D, where originally, people came forward with various ideas of how they were going to do the program. And he said, well, do them all because we really don't know. It's a very bold decision to make, a risky one. So, there was some serendipity there. I think that the wisdom, though, was his realization that, back to the translational piece, we're not really going to know until we try this. And because actually as a modality, it isn't very toxic, not in comparison with a lot of other stuff in cancer, that we weren't going to necessarily be putting a lot of patients at risk by doing this, but we were only going to know when we knew. So, some luck, but, good judgment, I would say, as well.
And if that's even reasonable to expect, that there will be one winner.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I think there's a few players that we need to be looking at. So, starting with Merck, they obviously don't want Keytruda displaced, right? Even with things like LOE coming up of it, they've, for all what we've just discussed, set themselves as the foundation in so many different tumor types. If we're looking at what they want to do, they're moving, into earlier lines of therapy. They're moving more into the curative intent side of things, but they're also going with sort of combination strategies as well, because they've cemented Keytruda so well as that foundational therapy, making it so hard to displace. They're more around, ensuring that it's added onto rather than replaced. BMS, of course, are they going to try and win, this potential title back? They are, again, looking at sort of bispecific type strategies and mechanisms that work there. Again, are they potentially looking at a more sort of displacement kind of strategy where, trying to overcome things like PD-1 resistance, maybe trying to get into sort of more of the cold tumor areas, is a place that they're potentially looking. AstraZeneca is one that we have to talk about. Absolutely, increasing their sort of size and weight within the oncology space. If you just look at something like Enhertu and how well that's doing from a, not just sort of a revolution versus what's existing there. And one that's sort of perhaps not too well known or talked about much is the sort of Akeso summit coming out of China, who may absolutely try and actually do a displacement kind of strategy with Keytruda, with essentially a better PD-1 and IO. We mentioned being aggressive and risky with your strategy or clinical trial strategies there. So doing a head-to-head versus Keytruda, although a large study and a high-risk study, if you can win there, that is absolutely a sort of a displacement strategy there. So I think those are just some of them, and some of the strategies they'll be deploying, whether that be from the actual therapy they're bringing to market, the combinations, the trials sort of designed as a strategy they're bringing. It raises the question of, will Keytruda actually be displaced, or is it more around adding on to Keytruda and sort of widening the breadth of it and improving on it as well?
All right, very exciting. On that note, we'll leave everybody on a cliffhanger and stay tuned for part 2. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.